Fox, the voice of compliance, back again with Matt Kelly, the coolest guy in compliance, for our live stream edition of Compliance Into the Weeds. In addition to being the coolest guy in compliance, Matt has been counseling me on how to stay warm in the cool. So, Matt, tell us about the weather in Boston, and then I'll relate Houston.
So I feel bad, Tom, that right now it is 42 degrees in Boston, and it has been raining, which, okay, 42 and raining is a bit of a drag, but it makes all of the snow that we've had melt away. So it's very pleasant, seasonable day here in Boston, outside wearing this sweater here, a bit of a heavy sport coat, and that was all. Not to be with it when it was 12 last week, but it isn't 12 degrees here anymore. It's life is fine for where we are.
So we're in our second day of a major cold snap, as we would call it, in the South, and it is 18 today, having hit single digits the last 2 nights. And we've had catastrophic energy failures here in the great state of Texas, with a full 30% of the state still without power. Some people for now 30 hours with no power. So pretty tough on a lot of folks. We at the world headquarters of the Compliance Podcast Network, we were down for about 18 hours yesterday, but we're up and running and back at it. Matt?
How cold does it get when you're out for 18 hours in your house?
Oh, I think it got into the low 50s.
All right.
Maybe. So anyway, Matt, last week we had a really interesting podcast around human capital issues that you had written on, but you were writing on it really from more of a, I think, a regulatory SEC angle, what the disclosures were. And then we tried to extrapolate from there what that might mean about corporate culture. That led me to start thinking about human capital, and that led to trust. And then we had a dialogue for the rest of the week around trust issues. For me, that was crystallized by the now former chairman of the UK's KPMG telling employees to quit whining about the coronavirus, hard work, and extra pressure. But there were several other similar pieces of nuggets of information that came up. So I thought maybe we could explore some of the other things that we've been talking about and you've been writing about, generally related to employee trust. And I think we both, I guess I drew from your blog post about human capital reporting, the latest Edelman report, indicating that trust was down, but it's not simply management to employee trust, it's employee to employee trust. Could you maybe start with some of the things that you've been writing about and thinking about around employee to employee trust?
Well, it's interesting because there aren't a whole lot of good statistics on that particular question. The Edelman Trust Report looked at what are perceptions of trust people have in overall, and what are the perceptions you have in your specific area. So that was a mixture there. Basically, people do put a lot of trust in their own employer, although that down, they scale it from 0 to 100, and it drifted down this past year from 76 last year to 72 this year. That's still really good compared to trust people have in other types of institutions. And then people have trust in business overall. That actually ticked some up, but only from 80s last year to 61 this year. So take that for whatever it's worth. They're kind of sort of trusting in business, although they trust their own a lot. But I do think that employee trust in fellow employees is getting specifically because of the pandemic, where especially for white collar employees who are generally working from home right now and have been for the better part, you don't get to see them. You lose a lot of opportunities to build trust, either in casual conversation around the water cooler or a chit chat before a meeting that you now don't have, or you just miss a lot to be able to build trust in fellow employees because a lot of body language isn't happening anymore. Even if you chat with them on iMessage or Slack or on whatnot, everything's a bit more about taking turns, and you lose a lot of that personal subtle body language that I think fuels a lot of good interpersonal trust, employee to employee. I do think that's a big problem. I worry about how that affect people over the long term. And I saw a great study that was quoted in the Financial Times where remote employees are likely to be promoted than in-person employees. If you're at a large organization where some people are meeting in person still and others are not, now play that out over the space of several years, the remote employees are going to probably feel a bit alien and left out, and they're going to see that others are getting promoted ahead. And nature is a vacuum. If there's not enough trust there because we have these new silted in-person relationships, it's going to fill that vacuum. It's probably going to be suspicion. It's probably going to be assumptions. The assumptions are probably going to be not always correct. What's the scientific analysis of quantified research on that? How could we scale it up, broad conclusions? I don't know if we have enough information along those lines. I haven't seen any like it. But if I were a compliance officer thinking about culture, which you think about it, I would be very worried about how to keep this trust going when the fabric that helps to preserve trust is slowly but surely getting more threadbare, if I can use that metaphor.
So, Matt, you looked at that specific issue around employee trust, or at least touched on it in a couple of different ways. One was around vaccines, vaccinations, returning to work, and then you also considered the new CDC guidelines on vaccinations and returning to work. I came across a Harvard Business Review article that looked at employee productivity and specifically co-workers in the work from home environment, that there's now growing discontent among co-workers for employees who they feel may be slacking off or not working as much or as hard at home. Could you maybe flesh out a little of the things you've come across around the health issues for employee to employee, and then maybe go from there into employer to employee?
Well, so I have been writing a lot about vaccination policies and quarantine policies, and I think the United States is in an interesting place because we're one of the few countries in the world where an employer can require an employee to be vaccinated as part of their employment. And if you don't get vaccinated, you could pose a safety risk to fellow employees, so we're not going to hire you, or we're not going to keep you on, or something to that. That's rare. It's not the case, say, Europe or the United Kingdom or Canada, or I think most other major economies. I am not aware of other major economies where, you have sort of power. But because the company has that power, it raises the interesting question of whether a company should actually force the issue. And I have been on several webinars and have been writing about a lot of compliance officers. Their first instinct is to not want to club employees with a heavy-handed policy. That really gets to reading a lot of distrust, raise some very awkward questions around issues and diversity and inclusion issues, that it's no secret minorities are much less eager to get vaccinated, much less trusting of vaccines, and they have very good reason to be skeptical of it. So if you are requiring all employees to get vaccinated, but all of your employees really don't want to do it, is there some sort of discrimination or issue that's going to raise its ugly head? I don't know, but as I often say, I look forward to the fact pattern that lets us think about that, because I suspect at some point people would have a big problem with that. It's not going to look to be many other employees who would be happy to get vaccinated. But if you're going to be seen as forcing the issue, I don't know a lot of employees would appreciate that. So I don't know how much that answers your question or not, but I think employers are in a damned if you do, if you don't position. If they don't require vaccination, and an employee does show up to work who isn't vaccinated and gets sick and causes an outbreak, could you be held liable by other employees that got sick from the first one who didn't want to get vaccinated? And again, like, yeah, many jurisdictions really could. So it's much more about the correct path, the wisest path, the best path is going to be that the employer has enough persuasive authority and trust to convince employees that, yes, I should be vaccinated. It is a wise thing to do personally, my organization better. Everything vaccines can bring a ton of benefit to many other people. It's the right thing to do. Let's do it. An employer is going to need to be perceived trustworthy to be able to make that argument. And if you're just now starting to think, how can we be more trustworthy to our employees so we can get them to do this, you're way behind on the curve. I don't know how many employers actually are in that predicament that just now we're thinking, oh, hey, trustworthy, we should be that. I hope that's not the case, but I could easily see where a whole lot of companies might be in that boat, and they're going to have some very cynical employees. We're going to wind up, it's going to be very difficult to get through 2021.
Let me sort of wed the Harvard Business Review article I read's point on employees not trusting their employees, Matt, to the point you raised about who gets promoted. Is it the person who works from home? Is it the person who returns to work? Is it really all about FaceTime? Should you worry about whether someone is carrying their weight? If you have to take up the slack, what about others? I mean, you've worked in some organizations where you had a wide, diverse workforce. You had people who came into the office, and you had people who worked remotely far before any of the pandemic. Was it just you had a motivated group of employees, and that issue really didn't come up, or was it something else?
I mean, when I have been working at small or mid-sized organizations with these hybrid workforces, so it kind of depends on the structure of it. Now, when I have been working at magazines with some remote employees, they weren't employees per se, they were freelancers. Now, they were regular freelancers, and treated them, and I felt like they were very much employees, but legally they were not. And legally, they were never going to get promoted. Freelancer to be or something, you hire them in eventually, but there's a distinction there. And I think what's interesting right now is that we have many full-time employees who are working remotely. And as somebody who has worked remotely for years, I can tell you, it takes a long time to get used to that, months and months to get used to it. It takes years to be able to and really feel comfortable in it. But even then, today, I work as a contractor for clients. I'm not a full-time employee of anything. I never expect to, and no promote per se, but how can you make employees feel, I would, even if I were a compliance officer, I wouldn't worry so much about issues. I would more about employees still feel invested enough in me to speak up if they see conduct, because they are literally out of, and are they also out of mind? And if you're out of sight to them, you might be out of mind to them. They might not particularly care. You might understand that what they see now is misconduct. They might not realize it actually is misconduct. They might feel if they're doing their thing in their own silo, the dreaded word, raising its head yet again. Everybody is in their own silo of one, in their office at home or in their spare bedroom. It can be much more difficult to collaboration, foster a sense of investment in the success of the company. It's funny on this subject because just last night, some old research from ethicists in 2019, they had published a report about when to speak up about misconduct. And the number one reason, first off, about 90% of employees said that they generally would to speak if they saw misconduct. Okay, that's great. And then 85% of them said they would want to speak up because that's the right thing for the company and I care about the company. Again, that's great. In 2019, before the pandemic. I wonder what those numbers would be like today, and how many people still feel that same connection when they are physically not present in the office, they're not with their coworkers. The closest you get is a call with some clunky Wi-Fi? How does that color your perceptions of loyalty, eagerness to speak up about misconduct? I don't know. I'll be curious to see what some research shows on that kind of question 6 months from now, a year from now, when we've got a good post-pandemic data period we can look at. And we'll see.
So let me pick up on two current events around employee trust that struck me as particularly damaging. The first one was the aforementioned, now former chairman of the UK KPMG firm, who told employees to quit whining. I've seen the video of that. It really was stark, and he did say that. And he went on to compound his problem by saying that there was no unconscious bias, which tells you that alone tells you that there's unconscious bias if you deny that. But that seemed to me to just be one of the most either worst or best examples of tone deafness and a way to destroy employee trust that I could think of, until I saw a tweet you retweeted today about Benjamin Moore Painting. And last November, they had summarily dismissed their legal department and outsourced it. And now they have require employees to have senior management approval to call an approved lawyer, have a lawyer assigned to the matter, and then ask the lawyer the question. And several unnamed employees were anonymously quoted in the article, basically expressed distrust because now they feel like they can't get legal advice. They don't have an in-house lawyer they can call. I've been that in-house lawyer, and people, you want them to pick up the phone and call you if they have any questions. That's one of the reasons you're there. And that really struck me as a huge trust issue, because now you have employees who feel like they may be hanging out there, and obviously Benjamin Moore is not going to defend them or protect them because they won't even bother to spend the money to have a legal department to give them legal advice. But that also struck me as a very damaging of employee trust. Do you have any thoughts on that story?
Yeah, the Benjamin Moore story, I am so annoyed by that decision. Right down to a terminated their legal department on November 6th, which is National Love Your Lawyer Day. I didn't know that was a day, Tom. Did you know that was Love Your Lawyer Day?
It's a thing, Matt. It's internal. We don't share that with civilians.
I thought you had maybe had it on the calendar at home for your wife, but I'm not sure. No, so like, who thinks that is a good idea? Now, Benjamin Moore is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, which is notoriously cheap. So terribly surprised that a Berkshire company would think this might be a good idea. And look, I'm as cheap as the next person, but the difference between being cheap and frugal and being penny and pound foolish. I often think what generates trust are clarity and predictability. Even if you don't necessarily like the other partner that you trust. Why do you trust them? Because they are going to do based on what they have done in the past, very clear. And I often think that I once read an Nelson Mandela about the end of apartheid, and how he said one of his important partners, whom he trusted implicitly, was F.W. de Klerk, the last ruler of South Africa, who I am sure they did not like each other personally, but Mandela knew because what he said and what he does are the same thing. I know what I'm going to get. Well, Benjamin Moore just chucked out the window an employee might need to get some information, and they don't have clarity on if they get legal help. They don't have any predictability on what is going to happen there. So they are not necessarily sure about what it's if clarity and predictability are cornerstones of trust, you would say that confusion and arbitrariness are these of trust. And that's what you're going to get when you do something as harebrained as fire your whole legal team and then outsource it with, I guess, somebody to sign a permission slip or something, or place a phone call to be able to get permission to go and talk to a lawyer. So that means that's terrible. I look forward to the fact pattern of whatever mishap is going on Benjamin Moore at some point, because it will, where they couldn't get legal advice and somebody decided it could and decided wrong. And Tom, you want to wind up talking about this issue sometime in the future where this went the company on the rear. And I will remember this conversation we had first. As to the KPMG chair, I don't pass if he was as much of a jerk as he seemed to be on that leaked video of his where he was dismissive of employees. But again, arbitrary, seems like it was rather and abrupt and just rude. And I don't think many people most of the time are capricious and abrupt and rude. They don't see that they can relate to a leader like that. Never mind that what he said was, in my opinion, just categorically incorrect. Of conscious bias is a thing. Of course, pandemic is an event, and you can't really get over it any more than I don't ask somebody who has lost a loved one to just get over and go on with their life. That is a very long process to be able to have that happen. The KPMG chairman in particular, I just wonder where his leadership philosophy came from, or was this a singular bad day? But like as soon as I think he invalidated his ability in any respect from the employees, and then when you don't have that, the trust goes down.
So, to quote a famous sage on leadership, the beatings will continue until morale improves. That statement did not come out of nowhere, and people don't wake up one day and say, you know, I'm just going to tell my multi-thousand person workforce to quit their bleeping whining. That's a leader who led by very blunt talk. Blunt talk can be appropriate, but if it's given in a way that destroys trust, it's certainly inappropriate. And I think the readings, the articles I've read on that leader is he did that sort of talk all the time. So it really was no surprise. But let me go back to Benjamin Moore, because there's a level there that really struck me as nefarious. And that's where employees had to go to senior management to get approval to talk to a lawyer. It's one thing to outsource your legal department and bring in outside counsel at a huge hourly rate to answer questions, however inefficient that may be. But now you have employees who can't even get legal assistance without management approval. And what if the managers say, no, you can't go to outside counsel on that, you just do it? Well, now employees put in an even worse position. And as one of the anonymous sources said, even if you get approval, it's at least a day to get a lawyer assigned. Then it may be another day to get a phone call. On the third day, if I remember my question, the question may now be moot. And that's the way business works. You have a quick question, someone calls and you answer the question, or say, I'll get back to you at X time with your answer after you talk to your colleagues. And so as a business process, it seems to be really antithetical to business efficiency, in addition to, I think, putting the company in a very dangerous position of employees will not get legal advice, but then down the road, they won't even ask for it because the process is so cumbersome, much like having to ask your father for money for an allowance when you don't have one, something like that.
Well, one thought that I have is, as soon as you are going to the manager to permission to talk to a lawyer, by definition, you are telling senior management, we have a legal risk that I don't understand. And okay, so now managers know about it. Now, how are they going to handle it? What if this is necessarily a contractual question that you have, but it's a compliance risk? Now, saying that if I have an ethics and compliance concern, senior managers to be able to get some advice, because that doesn't sound to me like this department would be pleased with that at all. It also gets to the question, and I don't know about the six of Berkshire Hathaway and Benjamin Moore, but what is the structure of their compliance program? Is it something that is part of the legal department? Is it separate from legal? If it's separate from legal, do you need permission to still have a compliance officer? Did that person off too? Quickly see how some issues that are quasi-legal, but also quasi ethics enforcement and whatnot, they get really sticky really fast with alerting senior managers that are aware of this issue. That might not be something that the employee wants to do. It might be just not good government practice. If you have a significant compliance issue, you don't want management necessarily to be engaging and thinking, what should we do with this? You want an independent compliance officer to get it, who can then say, we're going to get outside counsel right now. And you want that to happen. And this sounds like this isn't here. So I would be, the more I play this out, the more I'd be quite intrigued to see what they would think about this sort of judgment.
So Matt, really a lot to unpack, a lot of discussions, and a lot for the compliance officer and chief compliance officer to think about going forward. I guess perhaps the only thing I'm certain about is we'll be revisiting this again.
I hope so.